Good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you all for joining this inaugural webinar. We're going to set a high bar today in terms of content and interaction. So today's webinar is Global Perspectives on Soil Carbon Sequestration, Trends, Challenges and Opportunities. It's brought to you by AgriDens, the AgriDens Initiative, which is a joint initiative by New Zealand's Ministry for Primary Industries and the German Ministry for Food and Agriculture. And is this a delay? Just excuse me for a minute. Right. So AgriDens is a joint initiative, like I said, between New Zealand and Germany to enhance the dialogue on climate and agriculture. And it intends to foster mutual understanding and political, scientific and technical cooperation in transforming agriculture. So it's basically trying to enhance and foster exchange and dialogue in addition with third-party countries. There are 4 pillars to the initiative. There's farm-level greenhouse gas accounting, food loss and waste, third-party engagement and livestock, and most importantly, soil organic carbon in agricultural soils. So today's webinar, we've kicked it off by an introduction and welcome by me. We're then going to have a global look at soil carbon, and it looks to be in sort of time zone order. First up is New Zealand, then Germany, Ghana, and then Uruguay. At the end of each session, presentation, we'll have 5 minutes of questions on really technical stuff that you want clarified. But then we have a 20-minute session at the end for general questions and answers by the panel. Just to highlight the following up seminar on the 30th of September, which is on methodology for soil carbon measurements. So look forward to that one as well. But we'll kick off today's with Paul and Sam from New Zealand. Paul and Sam, the floor is yours if you'd like to share your screen or introduce yourselves.
Great, thanks, Mark. Yep, just give me a second and we'll get our slides shared. And then we'll kick into it. Okay, that's that one, share that one. Make it full screen and check that you guys can see that okay.
Yep, all good, thanks, Paul.
That's good. Just give me a second. Just about set to go. Yeah, so thanks very much, Mark. So I'm going to kick off, and then Sam McNally will continue after me. Both Sam and I are from the Manaaki Whenua group of the New Bioeconomy Science Research Institute, and this was formed from the merger of Ag Research, Plant and Food Research, Scion and Manaaki Whenua just recently. As I said, I'm going to kick off with a little bit of background on the context of New Zealand, and then a brief overview of national soil carbon and inventory reporting. And then I'm going to pass over to Sam, and he's going to talk more about specific management practices and the effect that that has on soil carbon. And the title of what we're speaking to today is the potential to reduce losses and increase soil organic carbon stocks, and giving a New Zealand perspective. And just emphasising here the importance of not only looking to increase carbon, but also the importance of reducing losses. So just the context for New Zealand, we've got a moist, temperate climate, and you can see in the north we've got a mean annual temperature of about 16 degrees, and then right in the far south it's only 10 degrees, so quite a large difference there. In terms of rainfall, the average across all of New Zealand is 2,000 millimeters per year, but that ranges from about 10,000 millimeters on the west coast of the South Island and the Alps to around 400 in central Otago. If we look at the agricultural land only, the mean annual precipitation is about 1,200 millimeters on average, but again, there's quite a strong west-east gradient with much higher rain on the west side and lower on the east side. New Zealand landscape is dominated by agriculture, or 55% of it is under agriculture, and that is predominantly grazed exotic grasslands. And that's the light green that you can see in the figure here. And that's split into, on the flat to rolling land is kind of dominated by dairy cattle, and then in the hill country it's sheep, beef, and some deer as well. Because we've got a lot of agriculture, 53% of our gross greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, and there is interest in the potential for soil organic carbon to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, and also planting trees as well. So just the New Zealand context in relation to carbon, because we've got a moist temperate climate and are dominated by perennial vegetation, we've got pretty high soil carbon stocks compared to many other countries, and on average about 100 tonnes per hectare in the top 30 centimetres. Grazed grasslands have the largest soil carbon stocks, even higher than our planted or natural forests, and soil order is also important. And you can see on the right hand side here is a map of our best estimate of soil carbon stocks across New Zealand, and in terms of soil order you can see a really dark patch around Mount Taranaki, and that is because those soils there and also some soils in the Waikato in particular are allophanic andisols, so formed on volcanic ash and have very high soil carbon stocks. So while we know that land use can have an important effect on soil carbon, and you change from pasture to other land uses, you'll lose carbon, and soil order is also important, we've actually got quite limited information on whether or not soil carbon stocks are changing under constant land use. For example, if cropping remains cropping, or pasture grassland remains in grassland. And that led on to the development of a new national benchmarking and monitoring system for agricultural land. And in this project, we've got about 100 sites in each of 5 broad agricultural land use classes. We've got cropland, horticulture, dairy pasture, flat to rolling dry stock pasture, and hill country dry stock pasture. And these abbreviations I'll use again shortly. So overall, 500 sites in total, and those sites are randomly selected and distributed across each of those land use classes to help ensure unbiased monitoring for the whole agricultural land area. The sampling is to 60 centimetres depth, and we're sampling on a 4 to 6 year rolling schedule. We've completed the benchmark sampling in January 2024 and just recently published that in Geoderma. And we're aiming to have 3 sampling times by 2032. Just a quick snapshot of the sampling methods that we're using here. It depends on soil type. Our preferred method is use deep continuous soil cores and then cut them into 10 centimetre increments. For some soils, particularly sandy soils or some that are very remote, we use dig a pit and use bulk density rings as shown here. And then for stony soils, we use the quantitative pit method, where we dig out the soil, we weigh the soil, and then we determine the volume of the sample by backfilling with plastic beads with a known volume to weight ratio. So this is just a really quick snapshot of some of the results. So here we have the soil carbon stock for 0 to 30 centimetres, and we've got the land uses along the bottom here. And what you can see is that the highest stocks are under dairy land, followed by flat to rolling dry stock and hill country dry stock. And then the lowest values are in perennial horticulture or in cropland. We can't simply interpret this as a land use effect because we know that land use is related to soil type. And as I said, a lot of the dairy farms were on those andisols, the allophanic soils with very high carbon. If you take out those allophanic soils, the dairy land value comes down to be much more similar to these two values. And from a greenhouse gas perspective, and if you take the area weighted average for all of New Zealand, agricultural land on mineral soils, we've excluded organic soils here, it's 101 tonnes per hectare for the agricultural land. And if you look down to the 0 to 60 centimetres depth, it's closer to 140 tonnes per hectare. We're interested in the stock. It's good to know what we've got, but the most important question is whether it is changing, particularly from a climate change greenhouse gas perspective. We will get those results after we have resampled these sites, and we are currently 162. That should be 163 now because we sampled a site yesterday. Of the 500 sites have been resampled, and we're working through processing these samples and data analysis, which is in progress. And I'll just throw this slide up here. We're collecting all of this samples and data from the National Soil Carbon Monitoring and Benchmarking Program for agricultural land, but that data and the samples are being used much more widely in aligned projects. And one of them is improving the National Soil Carbon Inventory model used for our international greenhouse gas reporting. So this is a statistical model, and it predicts changes in soil carbon stocks with changes in land use. It was last refined and renewed in 2014, and then it only used 2,050 unique measurement sites. We've now got data for over 4,500 sites. So this is sampling since 2014 and a range of projects, and also a little bit of collection of some more historic data that was sitting in other databases. We've collated that all into the National Soil Database, and all of the stock calculations are now harmonized through R scripts to make it much more efficient and repeatable, and the model is being refined to be more spatially explicit. This project is funded by the Ministry for the Environment, and we're looking to wrap this up by the June 2026. And there'll be a number of outputs then, including an improved map of national soil carbon stocks. So I'll focus just at that national level on soil carbon monitoring and the inventory. And now I'm going to pass over to Sam McNally, who's going to talk more specifically about the effect of management practices on soil carbon.
Great, thanks, Paul. Yeah, so like Paul said, what he's talked about up to date has been all at the national kind of scale and looking at land use effects, but we're really interested in looking at options that farmers could do within a land use. So our colleague David Whitehead led a piece of work last year that looked at 9 established or emerging interventions that could be done by a farmer to either reduce soil carbon losses or increase soil carbon stocks. And we did this as a case study just at the farm scale within grasslands for New Zealand. So I just want to focus on that for the remainder of this talk. Next slide, Paul. So to do this assessment, we kind of grouped these 9 interventions into kind of 3 broad categories. The first category was around carbon inputs or ways you could change carbon inputs. The second one was around carbon protection, so the ability of a soil to protect carbon to mitigate losses or to protect new carbon coming in. And then the third one was around integrated systems. So if you think about grazed grassland systems, integrating trees into these would be a way of integrating or an integrated system. So you're still grazing around the trees, but you're kind of bringing trees in to have an effect on soil carbon. So to assess these potential, we kind of looked at the effect that they would have on at the farm scale. So we looked at basically changes that we'd expect in terms of tonnes per hectare. And these assessments were largely based on available literature information or evidence that had been done in New Zealand. And we also considered how other things like soil properties and climate might influence this potential. So we're kind of acknowledging what you might expect based on the carbon or the soil you have and the potential you might get. But also things like the soil you're looking at where the intervention goes will have a big influence on how it will protect carbon coming in, but also how vulnerable that carbon is to being lost. So I think that all the, I guess the key here is that these interventions won't be applicable to all soils within New Zealand. So we're trying to get a bit of a handle on how that how we might expect these to react. And I want to highlight that they were all based at the farm scale, so they had to be changes that a farmer could make. And so part of this is they had to be practical and something that would fit within their practices. So that's why we kind of constrained it to these 9 interventions. From here, we kind of wanted to scale up what you'd expect at the paddock scale to what you might expect the potential to be at the national scale. So to do this, we used kind of a scaling approach where we considered lots of different aspects, such as the land area that that intervention might be applicable across, the time to implement that, but also the likelihood of adoption. So some of these management practices would take time to implement, and a good example here would be in the carbon inputs. You could switch to a deep rooting or more diverse sward, but the reality is you couldn't do all of that in one go. It's going to take some time to implement, and so we wanted to be quite careful in how we looked at this potential, acknowledging at the time that this would take. So a lot of our estimates are probably quite conservative because we didn't say we didn't multiply the intervention by the maximum area that was available. The other thing was that all these results are based on a 20-year time frame, and this was kind of the minimum time that you'd expect to reach a new steady state. And so that all our results were presented over a 20-year time frame. So I just want to, I'll present the kind of outcome, all the results we found with these 9 interventions, if you go to the next slide, Paul. And what we'll present is in a figure with these 3 axes. And I just want to briefly explain the 3 axes before I bring the data in. The x-axis is the potential land area that the practice or the intervention could apply over. The left-hand y-axis is the potential national carbon loss avoided. So that's that you're mitigating carbon loss, or the carbon that could be gained over a 20-year period. And the right-hand axis is the potential mitigation of national agricultural greenhouse gas emissions over the 20-year period. So that's taken into account what you could gain or the loss avoidance as a proportion of the national emission for the same 20-year period. I also wanted to kind of highlight that the potential land area, like I said before, was a conservative estimate. It wasn't the maximum area that you could apply it over. It was some careful assumptions about what realistic areas that you could apply these interventions over. When we bring these 9 interventions over, one thing you'll see here is there's a colour associated with them. So for example, the green or water table management on organic soils or peat soils, this green colour represents kind of the confidence we have around the intervention. And so we're relatively confident that if you raise water tables in organic soils or peat soils, you'll reduce emissions. I guess the thing that we're uncertain about is at the scale which you could apply it over. Can we raise water tables across all the organic soils easily? And that's sort of something that needs to work through. The yellow colours, we have slightly less confidence. So this is things like full inversion tillage, integration of trees, and reduced cropping on organic soils. There's some evidence, or some quite good evidence, that you would have either gains in carbon associated with these practices or reduced losses. But the thing that reduces our confidence here is that the data at a large scale is lacking. So some of these practices might have been done on 1 or 2 soils, say in New Zealand, but not at wide scale to really have confidence of the numbers. And then the brown colours are ones that we have the lowest confidence of. There's some good evidence in international literature or maybe laboratory studies, but they haven't been tested at scale in New Zealand or in field conditions. And so things like, I want to highlight sort of deep-rooted or diverse species here in that brown one. There's evidence that if you increase root and depth of plants, you'll increase carbon inputs and therefore increase soil carbon. But there has been kind of conflicting results in literature. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, or you get no result. But this also hasn't been applied at scale across New Zealand to really understand these effects. The one thing you can note here is that, particularly on the right-hand axis, the potential mitigation of national agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, that you're kind of ranging from a very small number up to a maximum of about 2.5% of those emissions. So they're not, these interventions aren't going to be provide large impact in terms of reducing emissions, but I think the key here is it's the collective of all these interventions working together that would have the biggest impact. And I think we have to understand where we could apply these, how we could apply them, and apply them collectively to achieve that big impact. Just go to the next slide, Paul. I think just to summarise what we have, kind of as Paul alluded to, New Zealand has quite high soil carbon stocks in New Zealand, and I think maintaining what we have is really important, in addition to trying to increase them further. So some countries that have lower or more depleted soils, increasing soil carbon is a real option, but I think for us in New Zealand, we have to really maintain what we have, and understanding how vulnerable soils are to losing carbon is just as important, and mitigating that loss. We can kind of see that there's multiple interventions that have promise, and I think will have some effect on increasing soil carbon. But we need to look at how we collectively use these to get the maximum benefit. And part of this is we need a lot of ongoing research to understand this, and particularly around the management effects. In saying this, we have got quite a lot of ongoing research or aligned work within New Zealand that we're currently undertaking. And so 3 examples of these are presented just below, and they will be also presented in upcoming AgriDens webinars. So the first one is the fractions or distribution of soil carbon in fractions that will be presented next week by our colleague Pierre. After that, we've got integration of trees into grassland soils, where we've got some quite promising results coming out of New Zealand as well, and that we presented in early October. And then the third one is about, there's quite a lot of work going around about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and substance from our drained organic soils or peatlands, and that will be presented later on in mid-October. So if you're interested in kind of hearing about more of that ongoing or aligned work, be sure to tune into those. I think just lastly, just to acknowledge, there's been a large amount of funding provided by multiple agencies within New Zealand over the years that supported a lot of this work, and we've come a long way in terms of understanding. And then I think lastly, just the AgriDens initiative to putting on these webinars. It's a great idea, especially to get the different perspectives around the world. So yeah, thanks for organising those. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul and Sam. That was an awesome start. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A already. So just to remind participants that use the Q&A button to ask any questions. I'll just very quickly kick off for the long-term monitoring sites. How do you protect or maintain site integrity? How do you make sure that it doesn't get planted into trees?
Okay, I could have a go at that one. In terms of site integrity, planted trees, we don't. They are monitoring sites, and if it's related to the project that I was talking to, we randomly go across all agricultural land. We don't go to just friendly farmers. We try and go to wherever those points are, and we've had pretty good success at getting access. And then if there is land use change, we're continuing to measure. So we, particularly in our hill country grasslands, we have had about 5 or 6 sites that have gone into plantation forestry. And we did expect that, and we actually calculated based on some historic land use changes how many would likely change, and we actually increase the number of samples within those land use classes to account for that. So currently we've continued to sample because that'll be really interesting information. But even if we drop out those sites, we hopefully will still have enough power to detect changes within those land uses. So we did think about that ahead of time.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, just some questions from the audience. How do you treat the incorporation of ash from zero carbon volcanoes into temporal monitoring sequences? Who's going for that answer? To answer that.
I'll give it a go. New Zealand soils, we do have a lot of buildup of ash, but it is relatively small, I guess, in the timeframes that we're measuring. Like between when we did a baseline sampling, for example, and remeasured, there has been no ash deposits. And there's been no substantial ash deposits across New Zealand widespread for, well, I'd say probably hundreds of years. So interesting question, but not at the timescales that we're working at currently.
Cool. And I think this question relates to Sam, that very interesting last graph. Multiple interventions are needed for large impact. Of what evidence is there that the various interventions are additive? Or is there
that's a good question. I think there's very little evidence to support being additive. And I think that piece of work we did was kind of a desk-based one. And I think, there's been no field trials that have looked at multiple interventions together and looked at that effect, but that would be probably needed to look at that. I know that some of the stuff that you, or some of these interventions, there's other trade-offs that you get. So for example, in the full inversion tillage, an unexpected benefit, I guess, from that was that we reduced nitrous oxide emissions quite substantially. And that was kind of surprising. But I think in a lot of those interventions, that trade-off with other greenhouse gas emissions also needs to be worked through, or the kind of the carbon footprint. So if you're going to bring in, like one of the interventions was adding clay minerals to soils, and in the lab, it seems to reduce losses of carbon. But then if you're going to have to shift a lot of material around to incorporate it into soils, there's obviously going to be quite a big carbon cost of doing that. So a lot of these interventions need to be worked through, and enhanced rock weathering would also be a good example of that when you're bringing in, you're transporting material around and stuff. So I think we kind of need a lot more information going on behind us to answer those kind of trade-offs, but also these additive questions too.
I'll just add to that. Within the work that we're doing, it hasn't really been presented here much, but particularly with the paddock scale, eddy covariance, carbon balance measurements, and then aligned process-based modeling, that investigating the trade-offs has been a really key focus of our work, trying to integrate measurements and modeling to look at the full greenhouse gas effect of these. And I think that's really important to do that. And then increasingly that information feeding into life cycle analysis, which has been really important for basically the customers of our products as well.
Excellent. Just in the interest of time, I think we'll carry any supplementary other questions to the end. Felix, you're up next. Are you ready to present?
Yes. Hang on, I'm sharing the presentation. In the best case scenario. So you should see my slides now. Perfect. All right. So yes, I will be talking about trends in soil organic carbon stocks and carbon sequestration potential in European arable and grassland soils. Okay, so maybe the first question, how are the SOC stocks currently developing in Europe? I will start with Germany, as we are in our institute handling the German soil inventory, which we started in 2011. It takes each round about 8 years to complete. And it's important now to know, in the first sampling, we did soil pits. You can see it at the bottom, the circle. The X is the big soil pit in which we sampled. And from there, we took soil cores as satellites, the A, B, C, D, and so on, and took that data. In 2023, we started our second round, which is now ongoing. And here we only dug soil pits as our budget had been cut and we need to find more efficient ways. And with some pre-testing and pre-sampling and some try and error, we found that 5 pits are better than 1 pit and the cores. I get maybe later in the question round into that in more detail if that is of interest. So we sampled cropland, grassland, and woody permanent crops in about 3,100 sites on an 8 by 8 kilometer grid. We sampled to 1 meter of depth and measured a whole myriad of soil parameters. The farmers are voluntarily participating. We have also organic and conventional farmers, mostly conventional farmers, of course. And they get a questionnaire from us with which we collect 10 years of management data. And as we aim to be there every 10 years, we hopefully have soon a nice timeline. Some findings, which are also not too surprising, maybe the organic soils, as you can see, store about 5 times more SOC than the mineral soils. And the mineral soils in croplands store about 96 megagram of carbon per hectare and the grasslands 135. So the 25% of the total SOC stocks that we have in agricultural soils are in the organic soils, which is only 6% of Germany. So in the German map on the right, the brown area in the northwest, you can see it. This is where we have our organic soils. And that grasslands store about 40% more SOC than croplands. So this is from the first round of the monitoring. And now we are in the second one. We have currently resampled about 1,300 sites and reanalyzed 1,000 sites. From the first site, just looking at the quick data, we realized, oh, we have quite extreme losses in croplands and grasslands of 5 and 9 megagram respectively when comparing the soil pits from the first round with the soil pits of the second round. So we played a bit with the data and looked at the data from the soil cores from the satellite sites and compared that with the pits of the second round and realized there is a much better match in capturing the heterogeneity of carbon. So from the satellites from the first round, we have around 600 sites analyzed, and they have been now compared with the pits of the second round. And there we find, after the equivalent soil mass correction, that croplands lost more likely 0.4 megagram in the top 30 centimeters and grassland 3.7 megagram of carbon, with only significant changes in the grassland top 10 centimeters. So in summary, we can say we are apparently losing carbon. This is still ongoing. We're still measuring and sampling, so let's see where it leads us. But for the final results, you got to wait, I think, another 4 years. Let's have a look at Europe. So in general, just like showed in Germany now, croplands are losing carbon throughout Europe. And before these soils can become a carbon sink, as it is aimed at, so the so-called carbon sequestration, we need to stop the carbon losses, which is sea loss mitigation. You can see most countries are losing carbon. Just Sweden is a special case. Keep the story short. They became great fans of horses, and the farmers changed their crop rotations to supply the feed and fodder for the horses. And those were crop rotations that foster carbon, soil organic carbon accrual, and thus they actually can show it in their inventory. So in the Carbosec project, which was part of the EJP soil project, which finished this January, we looked at, or we created a database with only European data and long-term experiment data. It was about 1,400 publications. And we just checked, based on European data, what measures actually increase reliably soil organic carbon. And it's broadly 4 categories. So we have the cropland management, where cover cropping, crop residues, and perennial legumes and lay rotations increase soil carbon accrual. In the technology sector, we have biochar, tillage practices, and irrigation. For the woody features, we have hedges, alley cropping, silvopasture, and the land use change from cropland to grassland. Now let's focus on grasslands a little, as this is important, for example, in New Zealand or also later in Uruguay. Here we found 63 long-term experiments across 8 countries. There was not a lot of accessible data for Eastern Europe, which is important. And we looked there at inorganic and organic nutrient fertilization. We looked at soil tillage and grassland reseeding, grazing and the intensity of it, irrigation, and enhanced silicate weathering. And to put it mildly, what we could find is that fertilization helps with SOC stocks, but everything else, there's either insufficient data, or there's poor quality of the data, or these experiments have just poorly been set up. So honestly, we have no exact idea whether this will work or not. So if we talk about carbon sequestration and the potential to do so, I just showed you a few measures that that reliably work, and for the grasslands, I will no longer talk about those, as the data is not very good. So what did we do in the project? We calculated an area where these measures can be implemented additionally, because only additionality brings more carbon accrual. So how did we do that? We had a theoretical area, which is the European agricultural mineral soils. In Europe means in this case including Switzerland, Norway, and Turkey. So we took this theoretical area, and for the non-inversion tillage as an example, we then looked at arable land that is being plowed, because here we could reduce the depth of plowing. For cover crops, as another example, we also took the same theoretical area. We looked at rain-fed arable land, as we assumed that nobody will water their cover crops as it's too costly. And it needs to be bare in winter, because only if it's bare you can implement cover crops. And we implemented a climatic factor from a different project from EJP soil. And then there were some measures which are a bit more complicated, and I took the woody vegetation as an example. First of all, we decided to look at cropland, grassland, and including the biomass of the woody vegetation. And technically, you can do agroforestry everywhere, but we're also hungry and we like food. So we needed to find something like, how much do we implement? Do we want to put one area, like 1% of the area, 5%, 7%, nobody knows. So we found a European approach where the European Commission set to increase the share of high diversity features in the agricultural landscape to an areal coverage of 10%. And hedges, for example, and agroforestry are such high diversity features. Currently, this is what it looks like. So we have 2 countries who have this 10% mark, which is Malta and Cyprus, and any other European country has some potential to increase carbon by implementing measures. In reddish brownish, you see the woody features on arable land, in green on grassland, and in gray you see other features such as ponds, or imagine Greece, the white stone walls. These are other high diversity features. So what did we do? We made 2 scenarios where we have an ambitious one. To reach the 10%, we only increase the woody features on arable land, as this is most efficient in sequestering or at boosting soil carbon accrual. And we have a conservative estimate where we took all 3 of these categories and increased them equally. This is one example. And this is what we got in the end by calculating it for each and every measure. You can see tillage can be implemented in most places additionally, but then followed by biochar, and then cover crops, irrigation. I would like to put your focus on the woody features. It's only a very small area, but this will be important later. So what are we interested in? Not only the area, but actually we want to see the carbon sequestration potential. So we need the area, we need the stocks, and we used an emission factor. So based on the database, we calculated European emission factors for these measures. So we took our baseline, each measure got its individual area of implementation, and we calculated with the emission factor the sea sequestration potential of each measure. And now you can see, for example, for the woody features, they only need a small areal extent, but they're very good at sequestering carbon. Partially, of course, because of the biomass that grows on top. So to put this into context, to see are these crazy numbers or not, there was a study from 2014 from Lugato et al. Who looked at non-inversion tillage, crop residues, lay rotations, and cover crops, and found a potential between 550 to 2,100 megatons of CO2 equivalents. If we look at the same soil depth as they did, we are at the upper end with 1,800 megatons. If we consider subsoils, so from 0 to 50 centimeters, we're at the lower end, as especially the tillage is affected by this, because if you take the subsoil into account, you more properly show the part of the redistribution within the soil with the carbon by not tilling or reducing tillage. All right, but let's put it a bit more into a context that our brains can better understand than these numbers. Let's break it down to yearly carbon sequestration potentials. So these are the measures, and we've added them up. I will get back to this later because that question from earlier was interesting. And of course, we have zero tillage and non-inversion tillage. You can't do that on the same plot. So that's why we have in the conservative estimate, we have the non-inversion tillage included, and in the ambitious estimate, we have the zero tillage included. And with the woody vegetation, we can't have both scenarios at the same time. So the same principle. How did we break it down to yearly potentials? So we assumed that after 50 years, the SOC reaches a new equilibrium after implementing the measure. For biochar, we calculated over 100 years as it's very stable. And the biomass of the woody features is calculated over 30 years to reach equilibrium biomass before they get cut and regrow. Now let's take the agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, including the land use and land use change and forestry sector, the LULUCF sector. In 2020 of the, let's call it the EU plus, as Turkey, Switzerland, and Norway are included, these are 740 million tons of CO2 equivalents. So our additional measures, if we could fully implement them right now, could compensate 20 to 30% of the annual greenhouse gas emissions. But let's put this into perspective. Rodriguez et al. In 2021 determined a potential of 0.1 to 27% of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions that could be offset, but that was at national scale. And of course, there are very small countries that we have, like Luxembourg. Those are also included, and that is, let's say, the 0.1%. But with the 20%, we are rather in the upper end of that. Now let's get into the feasibility, and I choose biochar as an example because how realistic is it that we get these measures set up? So in our scenario, we would need 2.8 billion tons of biochar, and the current EBC certified production is 0.064 million tons of biochar. So it would take about 43,750 years to produce that biochar. Not very feasible in my opinion, and that means we need more biomass. And where could that come from? Because that's the age-old question. We could use hedge prunings, which are currently not used in Europe. We could implement our woody vegetation measure and harvest from there woody biomass. And currently straw that is used for energy production, so it's already removed from the field and can't contribute to SOC accrual. So as it's burned, if we took that, we can also produce quite a lot of biochar. And then we are down to 68 years. Still a lot, but much better than before. But also that means we need the production units. We need to give the woody vegetation time to grow large enough to be harvested. So still a bit shaky to get all that biochar. Is there more to consider? Yes, of course. We need to consider the reversibility of carbon sequestration in soils. So let's say we start a measure and implement it. It's nicely sequestering carbon, yay. At some point reaches the equilibrium, and then we end the measure and we lose everything we've just done. So only with a long-term storage of additional SOC, the full climate mitigation impact can be achieved. We need to consider non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, the trade-offs and co-benefits. Just as an example, let's look here at the no-tillage. If you implement no-tillage, you may reduce your CO2 emissions, but you may increase your N2O emissions. And in the end, you need to calculate which one weighs heavier. We need to consider leakage effects, which means if these are my field sites and I put organic fertilizer and now I say, in this one spot, I want to increase my SOC. So I just put most of my fertilizer there. Well, yeah, then this field gets more, but the others get less organic fertilizer. So basically, you're just transferring carbon with manure, but you're not enhancing soil carbon stocks at large scale. And we need to think about the associated costs. We also calculated those in Carbosec. So you see the dotted line, which is the current carbon price. And on the left end in blue, you see the woody measures, basically the agroforestry measures, and those are saving you money as you need to pay less for your carbon emissions. Everything above the line costs you money. So the carbon price, either the carbon price needs to rise to make those useful, or let's say the production of biochar needs to become cheaper, and then biochar may become a feasible option in terms of money. So the recommendation and take-home messages are: we need to address data gaps to improve the accuracy and consistency of data, not only in the soil monitoring, but also when creating emission factors, as we've done. We need to optimize land use. So we need to have strategic land use optimization to really, and combine the measures to get the real carbon sequestration potential out of the soil. We need to increase SOC, as this can contribute to climate mitigation, yes, but as I've shown, only 20 to 30% of European emissions. That means still the greenhouse gas emission reduction in the agricultural sector remains crucial. And in general, working for more soil organic carbon is not for the climate, but just for soil health, to improve the soils, which in turn also helps with the climate. And with this, I would leave it for the question time and stop sharing. Whoop, here we go.
Thank you for that, Felix. Just to keep the time, we'll transfer questions to the end, if that's right, and I'll ask Vincent to present, please. It's looking good, Vincent. The floor is yours. Except you're still muted, Vincent.
Oh, sorry. Okay, great. So I'm presenting on carbon sequestration in agricultural and non-agricultural lands in Ghana. And I'm from the University of Science and Technology in Kumasi. So I will take you through the outline for the presentation. I will look at some of the demographics of Ghana, and then take you through the agricultural landscape of Ghana and also the agroecological zones. And then I'll present some key case studies of work being done in Ghana, funded by the Ministry for Primary Industry, New Zealand, and then draw some conclusions on the way forward. So Ghana is in West Africa with 16 political regions, and of course, over 30 million people. And we have 6 agroecological zones in Ghana, and agriculture is mostly rain-fed. It depends on rainfall. And then we have a number of soils typical of West Africa, but the dominant soil types are basically the lazy soils that cut across the nation. We have acri soils, and of course, we have ferrous soils in the southwestern part of Ghana, not a dominant soil, but of very much interest in soil science because of the pseudo-sand structures in the subsoil. So in Ghana, the savanna area constitutes about 30% of the landscape, that is the savanna woodland, and of course 25% coming from bush fallow and other land uses. And then tree crops constitute about 5%, and you have 7% going for annual crops. This is the recent land use figures for the country. So as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the agroecological zones of Ghana, you see that in the northern part, we have the Guinea Savannah zone and then the Sudan Savannah. And these areas are unimodal rainfall. There is only one rainfall season. Then you wait for a longer period of dry season to have another rainfall. And if you come to the middle belt, you have the semi-deciduous forest zone, and of course, the tropical rainforest in the extreme southwestern portion of Ghana. And then we have the coastal savanna landscape that borders the Accra-Keta plains of the country. So this is the typical look of the vegetation in the rainforest zone of Ghana. And you can see the Guinea Savannah zone here, which is of a woodland agroecological zone. And these are some of the tree crops grown in Ghana. We have rubber, cocoa, which is a political crop. And of course, we have some cereals and then other tree crops. Up north, these are drought-tolerant crops that are grown, specifically millet and sorghum. And if you go to the extreme southwestern corner of Ghana, we have coconut, and also in the coastal belt of the country. So I want to present some key findings for some of the research funded by the following institutional logos you can see. The recent one was the Royal Society of the UK government that funded much of this work and currently being funded by the Ministry for Primary Industry, New Zealand. So this is one of the work we did in the forest savanna zone of Ghana and also the Sudan and then the Guinea Savannah zone. Here, we look at, how do we call it, crop diversification and conservation agriculture, where the government instituted a number of conservation agricultural practices of reduced tillage, minimal soil disturbance, and of course, residue retention on the field. These were compared against a traditional farmer's field where none of these conservation practices are really in place. So you can see that the carbon stocks are actually very high. After 4 years, we did this in the medium term of four years. We saw carbon increasing about 2 to 3 folds in some of these land use types across 5 different communities in these areas of Ghana. This is due mostly to the interventions in terms of soil carbon management. Then we did a very interesting work in the Mole National Park of Ghana, which is the largest park in the country. Here we have a number of indigenes that were improving the soil. They were using household waste to improve the soil. And when the park was gazetted, these areas were left as part of the park. So we saw that there were a number of soil improvement activities on these lands, and we measured how carbon persisted over decadal time scale. There was an earlier work in 1978 that looked at carbon concentration, nutrient concentration in these land use types. So when you look at it carefully, you will see that the forest growth, which is anthropogenically created, has much more carbon than the surrounding landscape. And this phenomenon is just very close to the terra preta phenomenon in the Amazonian forest, as we know, in the Amazon. So as part of this work, we also measured the persistence of carbon in these soils. And we saw that over 55% of the carbon is stabilized in the mineral pool. And this holds promise for long-term carbon sequestration. In literature, we have a number of debates around if you want to store carbon in the mineral pool, that is good news for long-term carbon sequestration. But then there is always a trade-off between storing carbon in the particulate pool, which is usually for a short term, and for crop productivity in the short term. So policy has to distinguish whether we want to store carbon in the mineral pool or in the particulate pool for short term. And that is a very good case for long-term carbon sequestration. And we also did a number of work in the forest savanna transition in Ghana, where we look at carbon stocks across several land use types, That is mango plantation, cashew plantation, oil palm, and arable land. And it is very obvious that the tree-based systems have higher carbon stock than the arable lands. This is basically because of inputs from the leaf litter fall increasing carbon in these land use systems. And then there's an interesting phenomenon we call the African dark earth phenomenon, where the indigenes improve their own soil, normally in a savanna landscape. They deposit kitchen waste and a lot of household waste. And over time, the soil is improved. And you always see at the center of this phenomenon a household that contribute to this, indigenous soil improvement. So we did a number of work. This is being funded currently by the New Zealand government for Ministry of Food, Ministry of Primary Industries, and we have determined carbon stocks in terms of pools across these areas. And we measured carbon in the mineral associated pool and also in the particulate pool. And you can see that in the African dark earth cropland, there are much more persistent carbon pool than if you look at the other land use types across the areas. So we want to we also measure emissions from this land use type. We are looking at in situ emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and also nitrous oxide. And at the same time, we are doing a laboratory study of the composition of soil organic matter over a 98-day period. So we also look at how much of the carbon is partitioned within the mineral associated pool. And then you can see clearly that in the African dark earth, much more of the carbon is partitioned in the mineral associated pool than, for example, an arable land here, which is non-African dark earth. You see a similar trend at the deeper depth of 0 to 20 and then 0 to 30 as well. So this is a good case that carbon is being sequestered in the persistent pool that can last in the soil for a long time. And I must tell you that these areas of land are so huge that farmers do their own cropping without fertilizer application because the nutrient status is much more 4 to 3 times higher than the non-African dark earth. And these are some of our PhD students taking some field data on yield. And also you can see a good crop of maize doing well in this area. So we have seen that this indigenous effort are increasing carbon stock of soils in tandem with the Recarbonizing Global Soil Initiative or FAO, and also the 4 per meal initiative of carbon storage across the globe. So in the same decidual forest zone of Ghana, we also look at a similar work where we have this site, and then you can see clearly that more carbon is stabilized in the mineral pool as, for example, in the farmland than the other land use. That is a different trend that we have seen in the New Bumfa area, which is in the semi-decidual forest zone of the country. So I want to talk about an interesting phenomenon in the coastal landscape of Ghana. If you look at the coastal landscape of Ghana, we have a very interesting phenomenon on a vertisol. These areas are typically occupied by vertisols, and then you have a number of thicket clumps growing on these vertisols. In each of the thicket clumps, you see termitherium, which are responsible for increasing drainage of the area, and you see patches of thicket clumps formed. And these thicket clumps are usually not penetratable by fire. The fire doesn't penetrate even if there is a pastoralist fire. So we did a lot of measurement on these soils, looking at the carbon stock of the thicket clumps, and then we compare that with the dry forest, and it is amazing to see that the carbon stock in the thicket clumps are much more higher than even in the dry forest. And these are very interesting phenomenon that we are very much happy about, still investigating a much more carbon stock in the thicket clumps than in the open savanna landscape. So I want to propose some way forward to sequester carbon. We have seen that sequestration of carbon in the country should be intentional. There should be intentionality in the short term, intentionality in the medium term, and also in the long term. And then there is need to emphasize conservation and regenerative agriculture, and also combine that with indigenous knowledge. These days, we see a number of proposals calling for co-creation with indigenous farmers, and that is based on nature-based solutions for carbon sequestration. And of course, there should be need for long-term field experiment. And this is what we're actually promoting under the EJP Carbon Around project, looking at long-term field experiment to monitor carbon over time. And then there is need for farmer incentives, that is carbon credit for farmers. And then of course, capacity building for farmers. And then lastly, there is need for stakeholder connectivity among policymakers, among researchers, among media, and everybody in promoting soil carbon sequestration. So I want to acknowledge the New Zealand government for supporting this work to support the objectives of the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, and also the Royal Society of the UK government, and finally, Agridance, Agricultural Mission Center, and everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Nice timekeeping. We've got questions, a couple of questions. There's one in the chat. Do you think that having more carbon in the MAOM than in the POM in poor soils could be related to the fact that there is little aggregation in those soils?
Please, can you repeat the question again?
Do you think that having more carbon in the mineral-associated organic matter than in the particular organic matter in poor soils could be related to the fact that there is little aggregation in those soils?
If you look at the trend of what we have seen much more of the accumulation in the richer soils due to better aggregation. And then we ran a number of correlation analyses that shows that tunable cations are very much involved in this kind of cation bridges to fix the mineral-associated carbon to the mineral surfaces. These are very interesting phenomenon. And then we're also looking at the soil surface area. How does that correlate to carbon sequestration? And then we have a number of issues concerning carbon saturation, which we all know is quite debatable in soil science. And I think I really don't want to tread that path. But generally, the African dark earths accumulate more carbon in the mineral-associated pool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent. Yeah, let's keep the time. And Ignacio, are you ready to step up and present a perspective from South America?
Thank you very much. I am sharing the screen.
Yep, and just make it full screen and we're good. There we go. Excellent. Yep, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good evening, depending on your time zone. Thank you again to the organizers for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to share that moment with you. My name is Ignacio Soma. I work in the Uruguayan-German Dialogue on Agriculture as sustainability specialist. I will present today about soil carbon in Uruguay, and the title is Science Meets Policy. The project that I work, the DAWA project, is founded by the German Federal Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Regional Identity of Germany, and implemented by AAK Agrar Consulting. On the research side of the project, it is led by the Julius Kuhn Institute of Germany and INEA in Uruguay, working closely with the Ministry of Livestock, Agriculture and Fisheries. In my presentation, I will cover three main points, as we can see in that slide. First, I will introduce briefly the DAWA project and provide some context about Uruguay. Secondly, I will share recent scientific research on carbon sequestration in Uruguay, highlighting findings for long-term experiments. And finally, I will discuss public policies on soil conservation, showing how Uruguay has advanced in combining science and policy. To start about that project that I am working, it is based on a shared vision between Germany and Uruguay in a world facing multiple global changes and building on our long-standing links between both countries related to agriculture. The focus is on the transformation of agricultural and food system. In practical terms, DAWA project mission is to connect governments, research institutions, the private sector, and civil society, creating a platform to exchange knowledge, principally on soil microbiomes and agroecological systems. Within DAWA, we work across several thematic fields, all with the same goal to promote climate resilient and resource-efficient agricultural system with a strong focus on agroecology. The main is soil microbiome, bioinputs, agroecology, and the topic that we are talking today, carbon sequestration in soils. To introduce Uruguay, this country is part of the natural Pampa biome. The Rio de la Plata grasslands is the largest temperate grassland region in South America, covering more than 70 million hectares across Argentina, Uruguay, and southern Brazil, as we can see in that part of South America map. These highly fertile soils support both agriculture and livestock production, but they are also under pressure. In the last 20 years alone, the region has lost around 2.4 million hectares of grasslands to other uses. This highlights not only the global importance of that grasslands, but also its vulnerability. Uruguay is a country where agriculture plays a central role in both the economy and society. As we can see in the map, almost the entire territory, over 85% of the land, is suitable for agricultural use. The backbone of production is livestock, especially extensive cattle farming, which occupies most of the land with an important area of native grasslands. At the same time, Uruguay also produces important crops such as soy, rice, wheat, and timber, which together with beef and dairy production are the country's main exports. This sector is very strategic for the country, as we can see in that next slide. Now we move on the second section of my presentation. I would like to talk some slides about science on carbon sequestration. Uruguay has a unique tradition of long-term agricultural experiments, and one of the most important is in La Estanzuela INEA experiment. INEA is the National Research Institute of Agriculture, and there are 7 long-term experiments. La Estanzuela is the oldest, which began in 1963, and is the oldest long-term agricultural experiment in Latin America. And it has provided invaluable data for more than 6 decades. This trial compares continuous cropping with crop pasture rotation and the different soil management practices. Based on this data, researchers applied the Century model to simulate soil carbon and nitrogen cycles, microbial activity, and crop yields. The results that we can see in the graph in the right of the slide show that increasing the frequency of pasture in rotation leads to higher plant-derived carbon inputs, which in turn increase soil carbon stocks, also microbial biomass, soil respiration, and nitrogen mineralization. By contrast, the other line that referred to continuous cropping, especially with tillage, result in higher carbon losses, mainly through microbial respiration. This study also showed that no-tillage practice help increase soil carbon and reduce erosion, and that including grass clover pasture or cover crops, boosts production and maintains soil carbon even in degraded soils. In the same experiment field at La Zanzuela, a recent study looks not only at how much carbon is stored in soil, but also at how old that carbon really is. This research combined radiocarbon data with soil carbon models, and the researchers traced carbon turnover over decades. What they found is that integrated crop pasture systems are particularly effective because they preserve very old and stable carbon pools. In fact, the study showed that what matters most is not only capturing new carbon, but also preventing the loss of carbon that has been in the soil for centuries. This preservation is essential for long-term climate and soil health, and makes crop pasture system a cornerstone of sustainable agriculture. In that slide, I show a figure from another long-term experiment at Palo Pique in 33, where soil carbon was measured down to 60 centimeters after 26 years under different management systems. The results show that native grasslands store the highest levels of carbon, while continuous cropping leads to identified losses, about 21% less soil carbon compared to the native systems. So rotation that includes pastures, on the other hand, maintains soil carbon much closer to natural levels, highlighting the importance of integrating forage in the cropping systems. The long-term experiments we also provide solid scientific research of how different systems affect soil health and carbon. That evidence directly supports Uruguayan National Soil Use and Management Plan. That policy is led by the Ministry of Livestock, Agriculture and Fisheries. The plan is a key tool for conserving soil and preventing erosion, considering land capability, crop sequence, and management practices. This policy is a result of an interinstitutional process that brings together the public and the public sector along with the academy. This policy is compulsory for the farmers that produce grain crops in Uruguay. I will say more information. That policy has developed three main types of soil conservation plan: the soil use and management plan for rainfall agriculture, the soil and water use plan for irrigation, and the sustainable dairy plan. All of them share a common objective: to preserve soil productivity through planned use, better management, and the application of good agricultural practices. The government had the aim to prevent soil loss for erosion, because Uruguay in the last 3 decades has a very big problem with erosion. So that policy not only affects agricultural sustainability, but can also lead to prevent water contamination. I will share some information about soil conservation policy along the history. It began in the 1950s and 60s with the first soil survey and the creation of the Soil and Water Authority. Later, the Cognac soil map was introduced, but going on the most important milestone came much later in the 2000 and 2010s with the introduction of this mandatory soil use and management plan. This plan has made soil conservation not just a recommendation, but a legal requirement for farmers to help reduce erosion and promote sustainable practices. these actions all together show steady progress toward more sustainable agriculture and stronger soil protection. Currently, and related to the project that I work, Uruguay is evaluating different soil carbon models with the goal of incorporating a carbon indicator into the soil use and management plan. This will give farmers a clear information of the carbon impact of their management practices. The DAWA project is actively contributing to this process through collaboration and knowledge exchange between Uruguay and Germany. For instance, early this year, researchers from Germany, specifically Tuning Institute, lead workshops in Uruguay, and just last week, a study trip to Germany has given participants the chance to learn firsthand about carbon strategies and carbon models in order to incorporate the carbon indicator in that policy. Another important example of how science-informed policy is the Uruguay Third National Determined Contribution under Paris Agreement. In this case, soil organic carbon plays a central role. The NDC set goals such as applying good management practice on 1.5 million hectares of natural pastures, conserving peatlands, and maintaining or restoring soil carbon in 30% of cropland that require land use and management plan. So these both policies that I share are directly supported by decades of scientific evidence from Uruguay's long-term experiments, which show how management practices can conserve and even increase soil carbon stocks. To conclude, I can say that Uruguay long-term experiments clearly show that integrating pasture into cropping system is key to preserving very old soil carbon while keeping agriculture productive. At the same time, conserving our native grasslands remains a priority, as they safeguard both carbon and biodiversity. On degraded soils, regeneration practices provide real opportunities to rebuild carbon stocks. And finally, Uruguay has taken a bold step with its mandatory soil use and management plan policy that is a unique policy tool to translate scientific evidence into practice. Here are the references used in my presentation. Thank you very much, and a special thanks to the Uruguayan Ministry of Agriculture and INEA for their excellent contribution to my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. I've got a question. It's really good to see those long-term experiments going on. I think in the first one, the oldest one, 62 or 63 years, you had an integrated crop pasture rotation. What was the length of the pasture within the rotation?
Yes. This kind of agroecosystem is very common in Uruguay because we have livestock in the same place we have the grain crops. So this long-term experiment is an example of how to mix both systems, and also, as I show, help to introduce the new policy in order to reduce erosion. So this kind of long term has like a sequence of grain crops and pasture that in the moment of the pasture, the livestock will be there. And then is the moment of agriculture, like 7 years rotation.
Okay. And I also had a question on your soil use and management plan or policy, and you call it mandatory. How is that monitored or enforced?
Yes, there are a specific office in the ministry that is the authority of fiscalizate and evaluate the situation. So each farmer that produce more than 50 hectares of grain crop need to present a digital rotation plan, and then the ministry with satellite images and their information system control that. For example, if the farmers say I will have pasture, that the pasture need to be present in that moment. Also, they fiscalize in face-to-face visits to the farmers.
And so are there penalties if you?
Yes, there are fines. Yes, there are fines.
Okay, that's interesting. How long has this been going on for, the system?
More than 10 years. More than 10 years. It was a process. At the beginning was like some extension movement, then a voluntary 1 year, and then compulsory. So it was a process, but all the farmers that have that present.
And so what's the compliance? Is it high compliance or?
At the beginning, yes, but now no, because the farmers acknowledged that the erosion was an issue, the rainfall erosion in Uruguay, and with that organization and rotation and management, the soil health is better, and also the erosion reduced. So at the beginning, yes, but then it was everyone apply the law.
Excellent. If there's no other questions for Ignacio, we've got a couple of questions from some earlier sessions, which we can address now. There's one, and I think, yes, this was for the New Zealand presentation. Is there sufficient data to model the temporal evolution of soil organic carbon once the interventions are adopted? And have you taken that into consideration of your estimations of potential soil organic gains? And can you provide estimates of timescales for those gains to be realized? I think there's about 3 things in there. Any of the New Zealand contingent want to take that on?
I'm going to start, Paul. In terms of that work that we did for interventions, it was based on kind of an average sequestration estimate you would expect to last for a 20-year period until it would reach a new steady state, so it would be a linear transition, essentially. To answer that, in terms of the modelling, it's probably lacking in terms of some of the interventions, and that's partly due to the data available is not sufficient to be able to model it. So yeah, I guess we considered there'd be a time component that these interventions would last for, and they'd last for 20 years until it reach a new steady state. Whether that's true or not remains to be unseen. It could last longer, and I noticed that Felix in their estimations used some longer timeframes as well. So I guess there's a lot of assumptions behind this sort of work, and I think yeah, a lot of that stuff's unknown because data's lacking, really.
Maybe I could just add a little bit to that. In the current MFE project that I mentioned, so Ministry for the Environment, we are doing some process-based modelling of land use transitions, so pasture to cropping, where we have a nice long-term experiment, similar to the one in Uruguay, not quite as long, and also pasture to forest. And so we're doing work on calibrating a detailed process-based model for that, and it's working quite well. And actually other related work we've been doing process-based modeling as well to look at management interventions. So we are exploring that, and particularly I guess the assumption that is under the current IPCC default, which is a 20-year transition, we're looking, this is for land use, is that true? Is that valid? Should it be longer? Should it be shorter? So we're exploring that related to land use, but also management as well.
Okay, thank you. There's another one again from the New Zealand presentation, and It's how do you monitor the avoided carbon loss in grassland based on management or practice changes? Does that, anyone want to try that one? Avoided carbon loss in grassland.
I could give it a go. I think the avoided losses that we're focusing on were in two areas, and the main one was probably in peatlands, so organic soils, and most of those are under drained pastoral land uses, and there are very large losses of carbon from those systems, up to kind of say 21 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. So they are very large. And if we, and that's where Sam alluded to, raise the water tables, there's good evidence internationally that that could really reduce those emissions. And I'd really point you to the seminar, I'm not sure if it was next week or the week after, where that specific question is going to be addressed in more detail by New Zealand and other countries as well. So that's definitely a key one for those avoided emissions where we know they're happening. And the other one in the calculations that we did in that paper that Sam presented was around the forage cropping. We've got quite good evidence that in a grassland system that if you go into a short-term forage crop, so you grow maize or turnips or Swedes or things like that, that you will cultivate, you'll have a fallow period, you plant your crop, it'll take a while to emerge, then when it grows, you get a lot of biomass, but then you harvest that biomass, the majority of it gets eaten by animals and respired, and then you have another fallow period at the end of that as you go into a new pasture, and that starts taking up carbon again. And we know that you get quite a large loss of carbon through that process. And so if you did less of that, or you tightened up the fallow periods in particular, you should reduce the losses from that. One of the things that we don't have much information on is the recovery. So we know that we get these reasonably, like it's in up to say 5 tons, or even in maize situation, more like 8 tons per hectare. But we don't have much information on whether or not that when you go back into the pasture, does that recover? And we've got some measurements and modeling, or 2 modeling papers that we're exploring that are just about to, one's been submitted and one will be submitted soon.
Excellent. Felix, I've just got a question for you. What's the interaction between the subsidies that are handed out in German, in the EU, and soil carbon increase initiatives in soil carbon? Have you got any comments on that?
Yes, we are or let's say the EU is discussing heavily the carbon credits, and a framework is to be set up. If I'm not wrong, there will be a vote in the EU Parliament in October on that. So they want to do that. Also within the project EJP Soil, we've been doing a lot of policy advice for this. Yeah, let's just say it's coming, and it has a lot of troubles and problems. It will be voluntary. And I think this is as far as I can talk about it, because everything else is done also in a different department here. And then I would be leaning myself too far out of the window, as we say in German.
Very good. Has any of the presenters got any comments or questions that they'd like to raise at this stage?
I'll just maybe add to a little bit to what I said just before, in that a lot of assumptions, say with international reporting and things, are that soil carbon is at steady state if you've been under a land use for say 20 years. And I think Felix really pointed to this as being important. It's like, it's assumed that, if croplands are at steady state, but he's shown from quite a big data set that actually no, we're losing carbon, and people are always talking about carbon sequestration. And it's like the first point is, in that case, is like, well, we just need to stop losing it, and then we need to think about, can we actually gain it? And equally, like, we assume that, say, grasslands in New Zealand are at steady state. That's what feeds into our current inventory reporting. But we actually have, and the reason for the monitoring that we've started is, can we actually get some hard, solid evidence to go, actually it is at steady state, or no, there is evidence that it's changing. And then we can also explore what might be driving that. There's obviously likely to be a climate change signal, changes in fertilizer and management and those kind of things. And we're currently in the dark about quite a lot of that steady state assumption. And I think that's an important baseline, that Germany's a bit ahead of us. We're getting some of that in New Zealand. Australia is doing more monitoring in this space as well.
I will add to that, and that's also exactly what we're doing currently. Our biggest issue is now that we realize that we will need this satellite data from the cores around to have proper comparisons. We don't have the money to analyze them. We're sitting on these samples, which is also 3,000 times 8, and we have analyzed 600 of those because then the money ran out. And if we want to properly calculate this now with the second round of the resampling, we need to find the money to analyze these satellites from the first sampling. And because there, with some, as of now, shaky calculations, we also looked into the reasons for the changes, and climate change is also a big factor of that.
Yeah, I also want to make a contribution to that. We are currently doing part of our EJP funded work by the New Zealand government in Norway, where we are looking at a long-term field experiment of different cropping systems. And you could clearly see that carbon is being lost over time, despite a lot of management. And then climate change is always one of the reasons, especially if you come to the tropics. We have kind of high temperatures that favors a lot of microbial decomposition over time. And also, in some cases, people want to ascribe that to drainage. Probably if the drainage is favorable, maybe it will have a kind of microbial feedback, trying to degrade carbon faster than you expect.
Excellent. Felix, there's a question for you in the question and answer panel. What could possibly be the cause of grassland losing more carbon than cropland?
Yeah, we're looking into this currently. Our assumption is that it is that in cropland, management probably has changed towards, let's say, more SOC accrual boosting measures, so that there we have reduced losses compared to the grassland, because the grassland management very likely has not changed, as there is no measure or very few measures to increase carbon there. And it's not a typical practice to fertilize your grassland here in Germany. And if you do, then it's only in very small areas. So we're looking into the reasons. We are not yet sure, because also we're still collecting the management data. But yeah, we hope to get the answer as soon as we get the data. Working on it, but probably it's the management.
Excellent. I can't see any more questions in the chat. Does anyone want to venture into a policy discussion, or should we leave it at science for now?
And I also want to add to Felix's reasons. I think some of the literature also quote roots, carbon input from roots in the grasslands also as one of the key advantages for carbon buildup. I can see that a lot of carbon is contributed by the roots of these grasses. And then management is also very, very important, as you mentioned.
Okay. Well, if that's it, we can close a little bit earlier. I can't see any more questions coming through. So now I'd like to thank all our presenters today. It's been really good to get a global look at soil carbon and the state of the science. Yeah, very, very interesting. So, yeah, do they have a clapping emoji in here? No, probably not. So, no, thanks everyone. And yeah, we'll catch you at the next one, which was, when was it? The 30th. So, yep, good morning, good night, and good afternoon.